welcome parents, social distancing, loss of connection, loss of structure, all of the uncertainty that we have been feeling for the past couple of months has really resulted in kids that are stressed out, students that are stressed out, and parents that are stressed out. So, as a therapist who specializes in helping families to manage through stress and anxiety of difficult life transitions, I've been feeling the stress as well. And as a parent, I want you to know that several truths have really come up for me during this time period. And one main truth is that our kids need us more than ever. So the parents that I've been talking to are trying to determine if what they're seeing in their child or student is everyday worries that are really part of growing up, that's related to a particular situation or a context, or if the symptoms and signs that they're seeing really warrant further investigation. So the first thing that I want to share is occasional stress and sadness is normal. So it's really common for our kids and our students to experience anxiety and fears as just a part of growing up. So think back to when you were growing up and all of the things that made you worry. For me, as a child, I really hated it when my mom left and I was counting down the time when she would return, right? And so for kids, they worry about their parents being well. They also worry about school. So a lot of the common worries for kids include, how am I going to do at school? Am I going to make any friends? Am I going to keep my friends? Is the teacher going to like me? All of those things are normal. And for students, a lot of their worries are around social competence. Am I going to fit in? So they're also worried about, am I going to make friends? The friends that I had last year, are they going to be my friends this year? They're worried about making the team. They're worried about if they don't make the team. And then if you layer in all of the academic pressure, oh my goodness, that's such a recipe for lots of worries. You've got PSAT, you've got the ACT, you've got all of the pressures associated with the college application process for our older students, and also post-secondary options. So lots of things to worry about that are really perfectly normal when you think about the context. And then sadness is also a part of being human. So our kids worry and feel sad whenever there's any sort of loss, right? So a transition, moving from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, can bring about feelings of sadness. Losing a friend, losing a parent, having a breakup for older students, or falling out with a good friend. Those are real concerns that even for parents, some of us are thinking that's kind of small, but that feel really big for them and are actually very common. So if your child or student is experiencing any of these worries or feelings of sadness, but it just isn't letting up, that's when we want to pay closer attention. And what I want to share with you is that anxiety and depression actually have different faces. So we're going to talk about the many faces of anxiety and depression. So I want to share a stat with you that might surprise you. According to the CDC, 1 in 6 children in the US has a diagnosable mental health disorder. And the range between the ages of 2 and 8 years old. And just thinking about that stat, it's so disheartening. I think for a lot of parents, it's hard to even imagine a preschooler going through sadness or going through anxiety. But sadly, it does happen. And what's really difficult is that it's often so difficult to recognize because they don't have the language to be able to share with parents what's going on. And oftentimes, even as they get older, they're not able to really recognize what's happening for them. So it's so important for parents to recognize that anxiety and depression may look different for us as adults versus for our kids. So I also want to share a quick story with you. So several years ago, I worked with a student, and we're going to call him Kevin. I've changed his name. And Kevin was 11 years old. And so what was happening in the classroom was really upsetting to his parents. So what would happen is that every time someone would laugh, or every time someone would snicker or make a comment underneath their breath, Kevin would get really upset. So pencils would start flying, papers would get ripped, and actually at one point there was a physical altercation. And of course, at that point, the administration asked Kevin to stay home for a few days and told Kevin's parents that they had to get a mental health evaluation before Kevin can return back to school. So that's where I got involved. So when the parents contacted me, I did a little bit of research, talked to the school, talked to the parents, and the words that came out in my research to describe Kevin were aggressive, disruptive, oppositional, and defiant. So I said, okay, asked a few more questions to the parents and discovered that there had been a divorce 2 years ago. The parents were absolutely lovely and were committed to co-parenting all three of their children. And what they shared with me was that Kevin was their child that really seemed to adjust the best. He really seemed to do okay during the divorce process. And they were really surprised about what they were seeing at school and some behaviors at both mom and dad's house. So after some sessions with Kevin, what I discovered was that Kevin wasn't oppositional. Kevin wasn't defiant. Kevin was experiencing mild depression. So what his parents didn't know was that he really internalized a lot of his feelings during the time of the divorce, and he actually didn't do as well as they thought that he was doing. No fault of the parents, he was really putting on a good face. And what I also discovered was that Kevin had social anxiety. So social anxiety is just a fancy word that basically means that kids and students are so fearful of being humiliated. They're so fearful of being rejected or criticized or embarrassed. And Kevin thought that that's what was happening in the classroom and just really couldn't shake that feeling. So I use Kevin's story to really illustrate what a lot of parents and a lot of teachers aren't even really aware of, which is disruptive behavior, irritability, anger can all be generated from feelings of anxiety and mild depression. According to research, 1 in 4 children suffer from an anxiety disorder. So it's so important for parents to be able to recognize the different signs and symptoms of anxiety. And with children as well as with students, it really is going to vary from child to child. So for younger children, you might notice that your child is excessively clinging on to you. So we know that separation anxiety really is the top anxiety disorder for children, and social anxiety is the top anxiety disorder for students. For your young child, if you notice that they are tantruming more often, if their behavior has changed pretty dramatically, that could be a sign for just further investigation. We're not saying necessarily that they meet criteria for an anxiety disorder, but during times of stress and transition, these are the ways that our kiddos are letting us know that something might be off. Something else to pay attention to is regression. If your child is starting to suck their thumb and it's something that they haven't done in such a long time, if you have a child who's fully potty trained, but now they're wetting the bed or they're coming home and they're wet and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? Those are some signs just to pay attention to. But again, every child is going to be different. So for students, again, every generation of young people experiences feeling social insecurity. They want to be able to fit in. They want to be able to really make those important connections and have those wonderful relationships. But sometimes it's hard. It's really, really hard, especially around that adolescent period. So you may start to see some withdrawal. You may notice that your child is feeling or experiencing irritability, which of course is normal for the adolescent developmental stage. Moodiness is part of being a teenager. But if you're noticing that that's happening more often than not, just something to pay attention to. And then physical symptoms of anxiety that a lot of my students report to me are sweaty palms, racing heartbeat, and then also very, very upset stomach. So, what we know about both anxiety and depression is that it can show up physically and impact your digestive systems. And one of the questions that I get asked by parents really has to do with the difference between anxiety and depression, and when to, kind of get help or get more information about each disorder. So, for anxiety, the key characteristics really are irritability, isolation, or not really avoidance, rather, of the particular event or situation that causes increased anxiety. And anxiety shows up very physically. Similar to depression, depression shows up physically, can result in backaches and stomach aches and just any sort of pain or discomfort that has no true origin. So they both have those things in common. With depression, you're really looking at prolonged or continuous sadness. And if your child is expressing hopelessness, such as nothing's ever going to get better, I don't see any of this improving, that is sort of the hallmark of depression. And then, of course, if there are any thoughts of self harm or thoughts of suicide, that's something to pay attention to. And so, even as a mental health therapist, when we're trying to diagnose depression versus anxiety, with depression, we're looking at 2 weeks. So, if symptoms are showing up more days than not within a 2-week span of time, we are really concerned that there may be depression there. With anxiety, especially when there's a life event or transition or a difficult season, it really is about 4 to 6 months. If your child is experiencing, anxiety off and on within that period of time, it could actually resolve itself. But anything beyond that really warrants professional assistance. So, another question that I really get asked pretty often is, what constitutes a red flag? When and where should I get help for my child or my student? So, the first thing that I want to mention is that it's very common for kids and students to experience a lot of the symptoms that we just talked about, and it's one day and not happening another day. Teenagers, as we mentioned, tend to be moody. But if it's continuous and the symptoms aren't letting up and it actually seems like they're getting worse, then it's something to pay attention to. Specific red flags, mom and dads, I really want you to pay attention to is school avoidance. If your child or your student all of a sudden doesn't want to go to school, that's something that I want you to pay attention to. If all of a sudden their academic performance declines, and there's really no reason, it's not like they've been saying that English has been difficult for some time or they can't grasp calculus, right? Just all of a sudden, with no real reason, their grades drop or slip, something to pay attention to. And 2 major red flags: if your child or your student is self-harming in any way or mentions that they want to take their life, even if they're joking, that's something that we want to pay attention to. And parents, if you're noticing that your child or your student is struggling and you're still trying to figure out, is this normal? Is this not normal? What I would really encourage you to do is to consult with your pediatrician or your primary care physician and just ask the questions. A lot of pediatricians now are trained in basic assessments for mental health issues and concerns. And what's wonderful is that they have relationships with therapists in your local area. So if you are wondering about what's happening for your child or student, please know that help is available. And as a mental health therapist, and I feel like I can speak for most of my therapist friends, we are so happy to help. And so please reach out. Help is available.